Praise the Lord. This is the introductory course in Translation Principles, Chapter 26, Other Figures of Speech, Part number 2. Okay, we are looking at the bottom of page 157. There are two new words you may want to say is metonymy, and the other is Schenectady. Give you some examples first. The pot is boiling. Now the pot actually is not boiling, but you understand this sentence because you understand that the water inside the pot is boiling. In other words, this sentence is not literally true. The pot is not boiling, but the water inside. Another example, the pen is mightier than the sword. Pen here represents writing or what is written. Sword represents fighting. From Acts chapter 2, it says, "My tongue rejoiced." The tongue stands for the person who is speaking. I want you to go to page 158 and read this part out loud. It's important that you do it out loud. And as you do it, properly pronounce the words metonymy and Schenectady. It's important that you read and understand all the way to where it says exercise 6. I want you to do that now. Pause the video now and read that portion. Okay, if you have read those and you should be able to, I said to read it with understanding. I want you to be able to explain. You should, after reading that, you should be able to explain to somebody what is metonymy and what is Schenectady, and explain the difference between those two. Now, if you are able to explain the difference between those two, you can do it in English, you can do it in your own language, then you can move on and do the exercises. In these exercises, we're going to underline any example of metonymy or Schenectady, and we're going to explain the actual meaning in this context of the words you have underlined. We'll do one together. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. What we would underline is a sword. And the actual meaning is this, is division. A sword separates people. You might think it's war, but it's not necessarily war. It could be division, because if you look at the context of the Bible verse, okay, again, you have to have your Bibles available and look at chapter 34. And if you look at, chapter 10, verse 34, if you look at verse 35, it says, I've come to set sons against their fathers, daughters against mothers, daughters-in-law against mothers-in-laws. Your worst enemies will be those of your own family. That could be war. War does that to people, but you might also say division. So you should write in your book here that the actual meaning of a sword would be division, to divide people, or war. Okay, I want you to go and do the rest of these. We've given you one example. I want you to do from B all the way down to, I believe the last one is letter K. Okay, we can go ahead and do letter B. You are supposed to underline the figure of speech, and the figure of speech is, I will give him the throne. You should have underlined that, and this is an example of Schenectady, and the throne here represents the kingdom or the rulership, the authority, all those things, anything like that. If you had just one of them, that's fine. But throne here is just usually part of the thing to which it refers. Carry no purse is the next one. I would have underlined no purse again, and here it represents no financial security. Okay? What Jesus is saying, don't take, if you've just written money with you, that's fine. Dalama, whatever. It means, Jesus said, don't take enough money with you on this trip, but just go out without worrying about how you're going to be, what you're going to survive on. The next one, D. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons. The figure of speech here is finger of God. And again, this is another example of Schenectady. It's by the power of God. Or you might just say by the authority of God. Or it could just say by God. Okay? If it is by God that I cast out demons, or maybe by God's word, or again, just God, any of those things could have worked. Finger of God here represents more than just God's finger. Not that God has a finger. God doesn't really have a body like we have. Jesus said that God is spirit, but we use a human language to represent God. And when Jesus said if it's by the finger of God, he didn't mean that an actual finger of God. He meant by the authority of God or by God. Chapter 11 of Luke says, blessed be the womb that bore you and the breast that you sucked. What this is there are actually two phrases here, the womb that bore you and the breast that you sucked. Would have underlined all of this. And what, again, you have to look at the context, okay? If you didn't understand this, if you got this wrong, it could be because you didn't look at the context. But it's saying, blessed be your mother. Okay? Somebody came to Jesus and they were saying, blessed be the womb that bore you and blessed be your breast that sucked. And what did Jesus say? You should look at what Jesus said in response to this. They were trying to get to Jesus through his mother, and Jesus actually rebuked them. We don't go to Jesus through his mother. But these figures of speech represented his mother, or her name is Mary. The next one. And the hand of the Lord was with him. The figure of speech here that you should have underlined is hand of the Lord. And you could translate that as simply the Lord. The Lord was with him. Okay? If you wanted to add more, you could say the power of God was with him, or the power of the Lord. Now, if you didn't get this right on your paper, you should correct it, use red ink, and mark it on your paper. Next one is the hand of the Lord is upon you. Same as the last one. just copy that answer. It means the Lord himself, the power of God. You could, maybe in this one, it'd be good to say the Spirit of God is upon you. Next one, almost the whole city gathered together. What is the figure of speech in here? It is city. It wasn't the city, but it was the people in the city. Almost all the people of the city gathered. Okay? It's not the city, it's not the buildings, it's not the streets that gathered together. It was the people of the city. Their feet are swift to shed blood. What's the figure of speech here? It's feet. Their feet. And this is represented by they. Maybe just underline all of this because it'll fit together. They are swift to shed blood. If you want to add a little bit more, you could say their hearts are swift to shed blood, but that's another figure of speech. Who risked their necks for my life. What's the figure of speech? You should check your papers. It should have been their necks, or simply necks. And what necks represent is their lives. They risk their lives for my life, or they risk themselves. Hebrews 3:17, whose bodies fell in the wilderness. The figure of speech is whose bodies. Okay. And, or you could just underline body, that's fine. And what does that represent? They died. They died. Or you can say they fell. Fell is another figure of speech. We can underline that one as well. Both these together mean that those people died. Okay. Okay, I corrected the numbering. The last one was K, not L. I corrected that. So, okay, we want to do exercise number 7. I want you to read these directions and look at the example. When you have finished reading everything up to point A, I want you to do letter A and then come back and watch the video again. So from the top of page 159, exercise 7, do all the way up to A and then come back to watch the video. Okay, I know there was a portion here. There was an example. I hope you read this example. Good explanation they've given. But let's do one more together. Woe to him who builds a town with blood. The figurative expression here is with blood. And we would translate that by saying who builds a town by abusing people, even killing them, okay, something of that nature. It could be woe to him who builds a town by killing innocent people. Something of that nature would be the correct answer for that. All right, I want you to go on now I want you to do from letters B all the way to N. And when you finish that, then come back and check your answers. Okay, let's look at exercise number 7, letter B. From Matthew chapter 3, it says, Then they went out to him, Jerusalem and all Judea and all the region about Jordan. The figure of speech here is they went out to him, or then went out to him, Jerusalem, Judea, and all the region of the Jordan. This is a figure of speech, so we're going to underline that. And what it means is these cities represent the people. Then went out to him the people from Jerusalem and all Judea and all the region about the Jordan. So this is a type of figure of speech that only gives you a part. It's using these city names, 2 city names in the region about Jordan, to represent the people. Let's do letter C. This people honor me with their lips, but their heart are far from me. There's 2 figures of speech, but I think the main one we want to look at is with their lips. Another one would be their hearts. But the main one I want to focus on is their lips. The people honor me with what they say. Let me write that. With what they say. Okay, the lips are representing the words of the people. Next one. I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. The innocent blood here is the figure of speech. And I believe this is Judas who is saying this. And I've sinned in betraying an innocent man. Maybe we should just underline blood would be better. An innocent man, that is Jesus, okay? Joseph of the house of David. The figure of speech here is Schenectady, house of. And it represents the family or the lineage of David. Okay? The lineage of David. All flesh shall see the salvation of God. What's the figure of speech? Flesh. They don't mean that meat in the market is flesh, or that type of thing, but it means all people will see the salvation of God. Next one, Luke 21. For I will give you a mouth. For I will give you a mouth and a wisdom. This is Jesus speaking to the disciples, and he's saying, the figure of speech here is give you a mouth. The disciples already had a mouth, but the mouth here represents the words to speak. I will give you words to speak or to answer. Next one, and the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door. They will carry you out. The figure of speech here is the feet. And it's those. And those, well, this sentence already has those. But those who have buried your husband, those who have buried your husband are already at the door. So you could just remove the figure of speech and use those. Next one, Moses has had in every city those who preached to him. Here, the expression is, one is Moses. What this represents is the law of Moses, okay? The law that Moses written down, or the Torah. The Torah is a name for the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible. Or we could say the law given by Moses has been read in every city. And a capitalized law. If you look in some other Bible verses, or excuse me, other versions of the Bible, you might see how they translated this. Moses here represents the law given by Moses. The Torah is a name for the first 5 books of the Bible. Let's look at the next one, Romans chapter 3, so that every mouth may be stopped. The Schenectady here is mouth, and it's every excuse, or you might say every answer. Yes, I don't need to have the word every here because I didn't underline it. But it's every excuse or every answer. You could say every word, but it's really, the context is it's an answering to the accusation of man's sinfulness. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup. The expression here is eat this bread and drink this cup. And this represents as often as you celebrate communion. Okay? And communion, of course, is just a remembrance of the Last Supper. So you could say, you might want to say something more like, as often as you repeat this last, I'm going to capitalize that, Last Supper ritual. Okay. Or as often as you remember this. Next one, Hebrews chapter 1. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. Hopefully you underlined throne, or thy throne. And what it means is God's rulership, your authority, or maybe rulership, or maybe you had power. Any of those would work there for that. We have 2 more. This one also from Hebrews chapter 8. The righteous scepter is the scepter of thy kingdom. Now, if you didn't know what a scepter is, I hope that you did the right thing and you looked up in a Bible dictionary. There should be Bible dictionaries in the office. You should have looked up this word. You have no excuse for not doing it. But this scepter in both instances is representing a rule and authority. Okay? So I'm going to underline both of them and put down rule of authority. Or maybe you had down a symbol of your rule or a symbol of your kingship. Okay, that's what a scepter is. Now, the scepter started out being a war club, but I think it's changed into being a symbol of kingship. The last one, Hebrews 13, let the marriage bed be undefiled. And what is this marriage bed is representing marriage itself. Let the union between a husband and wife be undefiled. Okay, or you could just say marriage. Let the marriage be undefiled. There were 14 Bible verses in that exercise, and you should have marked them on your paper. Hopefully you wrote them in black or blue ink, and you should use red ink to correct them. I want you to look at those 14 and see if you missed a lot of them, then it might be good for you to go back and redo all of them again. Even if some of them you know, do them again. This is practice, and this is important that you practice, that you understand these things. And if you're still not getting it, then you need to ask somebody else who's taking the same training as you are and say, can you help me? I don't understand this particular exercise. We're going to go on now and do section 6 of this chapter called personification. To do this section, I want you to read these two examples out loud to yourself, and then go to the top of page 160. I want you to read this part to yourself, and you should read these things out loud so that you have good, put effort into it. Okay, if you finished reading that, I want us to look at these exercises. It says, I want you to imagine you're translating into a language in which personification is not possible. It's not possible to personify. So re-express each of the following passages, avoiding the use of personification. We're going to take number A here as an example. It's from Numbers chapter 13. It says, the land is a land that devours its inhabitants. How would you re-express this personification? They're using the land that devours. Of course, land cannot eat people. You might say something like, the land has mighty armies that kill the people. Maybe that's the emphasis, or maybe it's an emphasis upon the soil itself and the situation. You might say something like, the land is not good enough to feed people who live on it. Okay? Something of that nature. So there are 9 in your book. I want you to do these ones from letters A all the way to J. They actually made a mistake in the book. After G, it should be H. G-H-I. But anyways, go ahead and do those. And then when you finish doing those, come back and check your answers. Okay, if you've completed those answers, let's look at them from Psalm 23. The personification here would be, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. I'm going to go ahead and underline that, even though we didn't ask you to underline it, but that is what is being personified. Goodness and mercy is not like a person, but that a person could follow you. But you would say that you would translate this as good things and God's mercy will be with me. Okay, something like that would be the answer. You might have something different, but you want to take out the idea of following, because following is something that a person can do. Of course, an animal can follow you too, but the idea that goodness and mercy are being personified. The moon will be confounded and the sun unashamed. Okay, confounded, if you had any trouble with this, you should look up what the word confounded means. And ashamed, you know that ashamed means to feel embarrassed of something that you've done. Now, the sun is not a person that can feel ashamed, and the moon does not have a brain that it can be confused. So you might say something like this: the moon will grow dark, which is exactly what the GNB says. Okay, and the sun no longer shines. They gave you the answer for that one, basically. The answer is right there. Letter D. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing. Can a mountain sing? No. So, break forth into singing. And the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Can trees clap their hands? They don't have hands. No. So this is personification. And you might translate that as saying the mountains, or you could say all of God's creation including mountains and hills. What can we say? Will show the glory of God, and trees what can we say? And the land will, and the trees also. Maybe that's an idea. You could do it another way. You could say the people who live in the mountains will sing God's praises, and those living in the forest will applaud the Lord. That's an idea. I'm not sure that's what they want there, but the idea here you need to see is that mountains and hills cannot sing, and trees do not have hands that they can clap. So if you're doing this in a language that doesn't have personification, we need to find a way to change that. Letter E, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. This is like saying that grace and truth is a person, and it came through the lineage of Jesus Christ. We want to change that. You can say it this way. Jesus showed us what it is to experience God's grace, and he showed us the correct way, or you might just say the truth. Okay? So Jesus Christ brought us grace and truth. That's another simple way you could do that. Jesus brought us grace and truth. That would be a simpler way of retranslating this without personification. From Acts chapter 20, the word of grace which is able to build you up. The word of his grace. Here is the word of his grace. They're personifying the message of the grace of God is able to build you up. It's not the message or the word is not able to build you up like a person is able to build you up. So we want to remove this personification. Okay, we want to remove this, and we could change it around as that. Could change like this. You will be built up as you listen and obey the good news of Jesus. Something like that. Okay? Your answer may not have been exactly the same, but I want you to see that what I've highlighted now on the screen does not have personification in it. We've removed the personification. Next one, the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Okay. Where's the personification? It's anger of man. How can we remove it and simply say, an angry man does not work the righteousness of God. Revelation 16, I heard the altar cry. Okay, the altar cannot cry. Okay, the personification is we're trying to make the altar cry. But you would say something like, I heard a voice from the altar cry. The last one, Revelation chapter 16, and every island fled away. This is a good example. Here we're going to keep island, but we're going to change the verb so that it's not personification. Okay? It's really not saying that the people on the islands, it's actually talking about physical land. So we're going to keep the word island, and say every island was, you might say, suffered an earthquake. You might say that, or you might say something like every island sank into the sea. Okay, the Good News Bible says all the islands disappeared. Okay, something like that. Okay, let's continue. We're going to continue the book and talk about, this one's called apostrophe. Now it's a little bit confusing because there is, we can make a mark like that. We call this mark here that I've highlighted on the screen now, we call that an apostrophe mark. Okay, we're going to call that the apostrophe mark. But there's something else that's simply called apostrophe. And as it says, apostrophe is a figure of speech that occurs when a person interrupts what he is saying to address directly some person or thing. If he's addressing a thing, then this often involves personification, as if he were talking to a person. It's used for poetic and dramatic effect. So here's an example. Lift up you heads, O gates. Be lifted up, O ancient doors. Or from Jeremiah, advance, O horses, and rage, O chariots. And one from Luke chapter 13, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who sent to you. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. Here's another example from 1 Corinthians 15. O death, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting? I want you to now read this section where it says a note on translating figures of speech. And I want you to read all the way down to exercise 9. Okay? Okay, if you finished reading that section, I want to reinforce it by saying this section is probably one of the most important sections. We're almost at the end of this chapter, but this is very important. It says that first you need to identify the meaning behind the figure of speech. You may forget whether it's metonymy or apostrophe or simile. You may forget the name of the type of figure of speech. It's good to know those. You should know those. But it's important that you understand the meaning of the figure of speech and why the writer of that portion of the Bible used that figure of speech. What were they trying to do? So remember, the purpose might be for emphasis. It might be for giving an example. It might be showing the attitude of the speaker and the response that is aroused by the hearer, the listener. And point C is it's saying you need to understand how that figure of speech is used in relation to the context of everything around it. Is this person being ironic? Are they being sarcastic? Why are they talking the way they are? So that's all important, that you understand the meaning Why did the writer of that book of the Bible use that figure of speech? Why did the speaker use that figure of speech? What were they conveying? What were their emotions? Once you've understood that, step number 2 is then to decide, how am I going to convey those same emotions, those same feelings into my target language? Now you don't change things. It's important you don't change the feeling and the emotions. You may say, well, I don't like sarcasm. We don't use sarcasm in our language. So I'm going to change it from sarcasm to something different. No, you can remove the sarcasm, but you keep the meaning behind the passage the same. Okay, there's a difference. Okay, you don't just change one figure of speech for another figure of speech that you may have in your language. You have to preserve the meaning that is in the scriptures. We're doing meaning-based translation, so you preserve the meaning that is there. Find out what that person meant when they spoke that way, and say, how do we say that same meaning in our language? Many times there may not be that same figure of speech, but you can still convey the same meaning. You might want to read this portion of the book several times, 2 or 3 or even 5 times. Read this portion of the book. Make sure you understand that section. We're going to go on now and do exercise 9. Exercise 9, let me show the copy from the book. Says to underline the figure of speech, recast each passage to express the meaning without using figurative language. So you're not going to use a figure of speech. And you can do this in English, or you can do it in your own language. We'll take the first one together. It says, you are the light of the world. Okay. I'm going to underline light of the world. That's the figure of speech. And I want to re-express the meaning without using the figure of speech. Now, you have to understand the context of this. If you don't know the context, you need to go pause the video now and look this up in your Bible. Jesus is speaking to whom? He's speaking to his followers. And Jesus is saying, you are well, let me say it this way. You have a message that will guide the world in truth. Now I'm kind of using a figure of speech there because I'm using world. Let's say the people. Let me remove the word world and use people. You have a message that will guide the people in truth. Or we can even just remove this and say, you have a message that will guide people in truth. There I've removed the figure of speech. I want you to do the rest of these exercises in part 9. Continues on the next page. And when you've finished, come back and let's check our answers together. Okay, if you've done these, let's look at the next one. Matthew chapter 8. Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. The figure of speech here is under my roof. You might say something such as you enter my house. Okay? I'm not worthy to have you enter my house. Or if you want to even remove that, you could say, I'm not worthy to have you visit with me. Okay? Mark chapter 11. Let me see. Was the baptism from John from heaven or from men? The figure of speech is from heaven. Often in the Bible, they they use heaven, reference to heaven, from God. So this means, was the baptism of John from God, or was it from men? Next one, D, Luke chapter 1. Fear fell on him. That's a personification. Okay? Fear is, they're treating this as if it's a person. So in saying fear fell, you could say he became very afraid. Luke chapter 1 verse 42. Blessed is the fruit of your womb. Okay? Fruit of your womb. That's a figurative expression. The meaning would be, blessed is your child. Blessed is your child. The child that you're going to give birth to. Acts chapter 5. You intended to bring this man's blood upon us. He didn't actually have some blood and intend to put it on top of them. This is a figurative expression, and it means you intend to make us guilty for this man's death. Okay, something like that. Acts chapter 8, verse 28. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Now, was he reading the prophet Isaiah, or was he reading the book of Isaiah? He was reading the book of Isaiah. He was reading, I should underline all this. He was reading, let me just do the part. He was reading from the book of Isaiah. Book of the prophet Isaiah. Again, I frequently say something like that. Your answers may not be exactly the same. It could be something similar to that. Okay, we're going to do exercise number 10. Some of these figures of speech may have more than one figure of speech. I'm not going to do an example for you because you should know enough now. I want you to do from letters A all the way to H, then come back and check your answers. Okay, let's look at these. The sword shall devour and be sated. If you don't know what sated is, you should use a dictionary. And drink its fill to their blood. There's figures of speech here. The sword shall devour. That's personification. A sword can, and if you don't know what devour is, again, you should use a dictionary. But it means to eat, to consume something. A sword cannot devour, but that's the figure of speech. And be sated. Sated means to be satisfied. And drink its fill to their blood. So you would want to change that. And you have to, is this the Babylonian sword? Is it the Egyptian sword? You have to look in the context to see what it is, to translate it properly. And it's actually the sword of the Lord. So the Lord will devour and be sated and drink his fill of their blood. Now, does God drink blood? No. So that's probably not a good translation. This could also be, the blood could be personified, a type of figure of speech. So I'm just going to make that a figure. The Lord would devour. Let me say the Lord will consume them. That sounds better. Consume them until he is satisfied. And get rid of that word sated, which is very uncommon. And until those who are guilty are punished. Okay. That's the meaning behind this. That's the meaning behind this. And if you don't understand this, you need to look at Jeremiah chapter 46. We've said this many times in this video. You have to open up a Bible and look at it and understand the context. These one little Bible, part of a Bible verse in this book is not giving you enough context. Now, if you made a mistake, you might want to pause the video and check your next one before you go on. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. This is a type of apostrophe where the person is speaking. And you could translate this, it's not Bethlehem, but it's the people of Bethlehem. You say that, and you citizens, okay, or and from you, the citizens of Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the people of Judah. Okay, he's not talking to the actual city, which is the roads and the walls and the buildings. He's talking to the people. Letter C. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose his reward. This cup of water is a figure of speech. Jesus doesn't literally mean only a cup of water. Okay? It's an example of helping people. So whoever gives you help, or maybe gives you encouragement, okay, of any kind, because you bear the name of Christ. You could consider this also a figure of speech, that you bear the name of Christ. We could translate that as because you are my followers. Okay. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. The figure of speech here is food. We could retranslate that to say, what gives me strength is to do the will of him who sent me, or what encourages me, or what drives me on, what gives me energy, all those things. Letter E, from John chapter 8. Then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham. The figure of speech here, it might be that you consider have seen Abraham. Okay? I could translate that and make it more clearly by saying, and you say you lived in the day of Abraham. To see Abraham is to have lived in his day. Say that you lived in the day of Abraham. There you go. Punctuation is more better there. Letter F. Fear not, daughter of Zion. Now, if you don't know what Zion is, again, you should have used a Bible dictionary. Look up what Zion means. Zion is a name for Jerusalem. And saying, could retranslate this is citizens of Zion do not fear. Okay? So this whole thing is a figure of speech. Personification. We're making the you might argue this is only the women of, you might say that, okay, because it's saying daughter of Zion. If you want to say that, that's fine. I'll just copy that here. Women of Zion do not fear. But I think it's probably citizen because it's the offspring of Zion is the idea here. Next one, 1 Thessalonians. But we would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep. Who are asleep here is a euphemism, you should remember that word, for dead, for those who died. Hebrews chapter 6. For God is not unjust as to overlook your work. This is a type of personification. Maybe it's also mixed with a little Schenectady. It's a part of something. God's not overlooking the work. He's overlooking the people who did the work. Sometimes these things are so obvious to us, we don't even realize it's a figure of speech. And this might be an example of that. God is not as unjust to overlook what you have done for him, with the way I would retranslate your work. Let's go on and do exercise number 11. In exercise number 11, you want to identify all the figures of speech in all the following passages. So there are 5 of these, and you should use your Bibles and write down on a piece of paper the figures of speech for each of these 5 passages. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do some of these. There are many figures of speech. The Lord is my shepherd. Okay. That would be a figure of speech. He lets me rest in fields of green grass. That would be a figure of speech. He leads me beside quiet pools of water. He's comparing people here to sheep. And this is something you would do, a shepherd would do with his sheep. He would lead them to green grass. He would lead them to where quiet pools of water. He gives me new strength. That's not a figure of speech. He guides me in the right paths. Yeah, you could say that's a figure of speech. Yeah. He's guiding you in life. Even though I go through the deepest darkness, I will not be afraid. You could say this is a figure of speech, or you could say maybe it's not. Because sometimes it seems literally that you are going through deep darkness, but that's probably a figure of speech. Your shepherd's rod and staff, they protect me. Has anyone ever really seen God reach from heaven with a shepherd's rod and staff to protect you? A literal rod or staff? No, it's a figure of speech. You prepare a banquet for me. It's another figurative language where all my enemies can see. I don't know about that one. Could consider that one a figure of speech as well. You welcome me as an honored guest. You fill my cup to the brim. Does God literally do that? Did he fill your cup? No, it's a figure of speech. I know that your goodness and love will be with me all my life. And your house will be my home as long as I live. You can say these are figures of speech. You can leave them as they are. I'm gonna leave that as they are. Let's look at Psalm 42. Because we did this from the Good News translation, some of the figures of speech are removed. As a deer longs for streams of cool water, so I long for you, O God. Yeah, that's a figure of speech. I thirst for you, the living God. It's a figure of speech. Day and night I cry. Maybe literally he does. My tears are my only food. Figure of speech. Are the enemies literally asking, where's your God? Maybe they are, so I'm going to leave that unmarked. My heart breaks. It's a figure of speech. Your heart literally does not break. The rest of verse 4 is probably literally true. He probably actually did that. My heart is breaking. So I turn my thoughts to him. Maybe. Turn your thoughts. Waves of sorrow over my soul. That's a type of personification. And the chaos roars at me like a flood. It's definitely a figure of speech, like waterfalls thundering down Jordan, like from Mount Hermon and Mount Mizpah. There actually are waterfalls that fall down these mountains. So those are some of the figures. Oh, some more verses here. May the Lord show his constant love during the day, so that I may have a song at night, a prayer to my God of my life. I don't see a figure of speech in there. In verse 8, I think that's fine the way it is. To God, my defender, I say, why have you forgotten? I don't see a figure of speech in verse 9. I am crushed by their insults. That literally is not true. You might be offended by their insults. You might be ashamed by their insults, but you weren't crushed. It's a figure of speech. Maybe they actually do keep asking you, where's your God? So that's not a figure of speech. I don't see a figure of speech in verse 11. Now, if you've made some mistakes, if you didn't do very well on Psalm 23 and Psalm 42, maybe you need to go back and listen to this again and try to understand this. We're going to go on and do Psalm 120 and then Proverbs 31 and Isaiah 44. You should be getting better as we're nearing the end of this book. Let's look at Psalm 120, verses 1 to 4. When I was in trouble, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. I don't see a figure of speech in there. That could be interpreted literally. Save me, Lord, from liars and deceivers. You liars, what will God do to you? I think the problem here is that I've used the Good News translation. Let me switch the translation. Okay, this is Psalm 120. I think the problem we were having a little bit of a difficulty there was that we used the Good News translation, and the Good News translation already removes some of these figures of speech. So let's look at this now. Make it a little bit similar in size. There we go. We're going to look at it in the RSV. In my distress, I cry to the Lord that he may answer me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. You can see that from lying lips is a figure of speech. You can say it's metonymy. It's using part of something to represent something else. And deceitful tongue as well. He's not talking about delivering from, talking about from people that are liars and deceivers. You can see over here in the good news that the good news then just says liars and deceivers. Let's go on in the RSV, verse 3. Another one here. Deceitful tongue. And you notice in the good news, they removed the figure of speech. And you might say that in verse 4, this could be, it's not just going to give you arrows, but you're going to be shot by arrows, okay? And you're going to get glowing coals of the broom tree. So you're going to be shot. He's going to punish you with these arrows. Let's take the last one and begin with the RSV. It's a more literal version. And let's underline all the figures of speech. A capable wife who can find. There's no figure of speech there. That's not a figure of speech. She is far more precious than jewels. You could say that's a figure of speech. I don't think I want to underline it. The heart of her husband trusts her. Now, that would be a figure of speech because it's not just the heart of her husband. It's actually her husband, okay? So this is an example of metonymy and Schenectady when you use a part of something to represent a larger part, larger whole. That he will have no lack of gain. It could be a figure of speech. I'm not going to mark it. She does him good, not harm, all the days of her life. This could be considered a figure of speech, all the days of her life. I'm not going to mark it. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. I'm going to mark this one as a figure of speech because what it's saying is that she has a willing heart to work, or she is a very willing person. She keeps busy. And that's what the good news does. Okay, we've reached the end of this chapter. It was a long lesson. Figures of speech are very important. And the last thing in this chapter, in the last page, there's a list, a summary list of the figures of speech. And you should have an idea of what these are. You should know them. Euphemism is very common. Euphemism is probably in your language. Every language, I think, would have some type of euphemisms. Instead of saying somebody died, you might say they fell asleep. Or you might say they rested with their fathers, or something like that. There's euphemisms for going to the bathroom. They're very common. Using the toilet, very common. Sometimes for urinating. We don't say urinate. I'm going to kupita kutaya manzi. Okay? That's a euphemism. You'll have those in your language. Not all of these figures of speech will you have in your language. Some of them you may, some of them you may not. But all of these occur in the Bible. So if they all occur in the Bible, that's the first step in translation, is recognizing the meaning of what the Bible is saying. And if you don't know these figures of speech, you might be confused when you read something in the Bible. So learn the figures of speech, know what they are, and then you need to decide what's the meaning, what is the intent of the author, and then say, how am I going to express that same intent in my language? You don't translate figures of speech literally into another language. Very rarely would that ever happen. So you need to, this is one of the best chapters to make you be a good translator. And I hope that you've learned a lot and you've learned it well.